I am really thrilled to be able to introduce Professor Nadia Shikhsenka of the State University of New York at Albany. Professor Kizenko is a historian whose research focuses on religion and culture. Her work has explored the history of Orthodox Christianity, saints' lives as a historical source, lived religion, political liturgy, women's written confessions, and depictions of religion in film. Her first book was A Prodigal Saint, Father Johann of Kronstadt and the Russian People. It came out in 2000 and was translated into Russian in 2006. A Prodigal Saint examined the cult of this charismatic priest whose popularity spanned the late 19th and 20th centuries. Today, we're going to be discussing Professor Kizenko's new book, Good for the Souls, A History of Confession in the Russian Empire, which has just come out from Oxford University Press. Good for the Souls is the history of an institution that helped structure the lives of Russian Orthodox Christians for centuries. That is the practice of confession, gadenia, a word that might require explanation for some of us. In reading the book, what struck me as a scholar of 19th century Russian prose is the degree to which literary scholarship, though not literature itself, has often ignored this practice, along with other religious practices that were central to so many Russians' lives for 400 years. Learning about confession and its meanings has certainly changed the way I read key works of Russian literature, War and Peace, for example, as well as the way I understand the role of Orthodoxy in Russia's history. Maybe it's not really surprising that an understanding of how Russians practiced Orthodoxy was not a big part of my training. I just don't think that there are many books like Good for the Souls. And that's because to be able to write about a phenomenon like confession for a relatively broad scholarly audience requires a kind of code switching. One has to know the ins and outs of complicated liturgical and sometimes theological questions, but at the same time, one needs enough distance from these questions to understand how they signify to others and how they signify in a variety of contexts. Such levels of awareness and essentially biculturality are, I think, quite rare. And this is why I'm so glad to be able to welcome Nadia Shikhitsenka, who is now going to speak about her work for a few minutes. After that, I will ask Professor Kizenko a few questions, and after that, we will open the floor to everyone's input. Thank you so much. Nadia.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks very much to all of you for coming, and thank you to the Jordan Center, as ever, for sponsoring us. Anne, I'm thinking about what you said about the code switching, and I want to come back to that because that actually sums up the problem that almost anyone who writes about religion and religious practice has to face. But what I wanted to start with was to actually talk to people about the two big things that I was pushing back against when I started writing this book. One is the idea that the Russian Orthodox and Russian Orthodoxy is somehow essentially different from Christianity elsewhere in Europe, and therefore it's bad. The prime example of this line of thinking is that exemplified by Richard Pipes, by anyone who talks about the violation of the confessional seal under Peter and so on. So in other words, the pushback number one is Russian Orthodoxy is different and therefore it's bad. The other pushback, the other thing that I didn't like was the reverse of that, which is, yes, Russian Orthodoxy is different, especially as regards confession, but that's good. And the things that the people who were favorable stressed was, oh, Orthodoxy isn't legalistic the way that Catholicism is. There's no satisfaction, there's no purgatory, there are no indulgences. The priest is not the judge in quite the same way. In fact, any problems that Orthodoxy has, that Russian Orthodoxy has, come from the borrowing that the 17th century Ukrainians and Patriarch Nikon did. This line of thought, people are probably most familiar with George Florovsky in Пути русского богословия, The Ways of Russian Theology, in referring to the period of Latin captivity or the period of Western captivity. So both the positive and the negative assessments agree that Russian Orthodoxy is different. They disagree on only whether that's bad or good. And I actually thought that neither was in fact true, that maybe the point was that Russian Orthodoxy is not so different, not so special, that in fact Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, Orthodoxy in the Russian Empire, like the contemporary Roman Catholic Church, like the contemporary Anglican Church, like the contemporary Calvinist City Council, had a police, right? So they could enforce, they could try to enforce confession the way that other Orthodox Christians, Serbs, Greeks, Romanians, Egyptians, Lebanese, and so on, could not, because they were not yet independent. They didn't have a police force that they could marshal. And I thought of this in particular years ago when I was in Salzburg with a bunch of specialists in Ukraine, and Serhiy Plokhy from Harvard was listening to someone opine about the powers of the Archbishop of Salzburg. And he said in a stage whisper, wow, and they say that Orthodoxy was Caesaro-Papist. These people had church-state linkage of a kind that we could only dream about if we thought that this was a good thing. So I'm actually wondering where the distorted or obscured ideas or blank spaces come from in discussing Orthodox Christianity. And now we can talk about literary scholarship, for example. Part of the problem is that there were and are, but especially were people who were explicitly opposed. The most obvious example of people who were opposed to what they thought Orthodoxy in Russia represented were people who wrote under the Soviet regime during the time of the Soviet period. Then it's very clear that there had to be a negative valence to the church-state relationship. A typical title published in 1930 was Офицеры в рясах, officers in cassocks. So in other words, the Soviet agenda, if you like, was to emphasize the negative aspects of the church-state relationship in Russia. But the Soviets did not come to this on their own. Heather Bailey has recently written very eloquently about mid-19th century French Catholic anti-Orthodox propaganda. And in fact, what's interesting to me is that the Russians in the middle of the 19th century read this and they reacted to it. One of the things that Heather does in her book is to show how the building of the Russian Orthodox Church in Paris on Rue de Rue was part of the counteroffensive. In other words, see how great our liturgy is. We're not as bad as you say we are. So everyone is reading, in the middle of the 19th century, everyone is reading each other, or rather Russians are reading Europeans, and Russians know what Europeans are saying about them. The Kazan Theological Academy subscribes to European theological journals, and I assumed that the other side did this as well. And so when I was talking about this with a Roman Catholic specialist friend of mine, and I somehow mentioned this, and she was very surprised, and I said, well, didn't your theological academies subscribe to our theological journals? And she said, no. And so I thought, okay. So in other words, there's an imbalance in the amount of knowledge that one side has about the other. Another problem is largely secular people who just don't know the religious context. And it's not just that they don't know Orthodoxy, they don't know really anything about other religious traditions very much as well. When I was at Columbia, I took a hagiography seminar with Carolyn Walker Bynum, who told us that in writing about saints' lives, in writing about religion, period, the hardest thing to capture is not the political context, it's not the social context, it's not the gender aspect. The hardest thing to try to get right is the religious part, which is to say the idea that people may have, did, in some cases, actually believe all of this. It's very useful here to bear in mind the work of Lucien Febvre, the problem of unbelief in the 16th century, the religion of Rabelais. In other words, Febvre made the absolutely brilliant and core point that in the 16th century, and one could also argue later in the Russian case as well, it was literally impossible to be an atheist. It wasn't in the range of possibilities. And one of the people who read my book in manuscript, Marina Soroka, said to me in all seriousness, until I read the stuff you wrote about the 18th century, it didn't occur to me that people really might have had the fear of God when they came to confession. And I think that's actually a really important point, that in other words, people actually were afraid that if they didn't tell the truth, if they didn't say the worst things about themselves, that they risked going to hell, and that this was, in fact, a problem. And a related assumption is that clever people, or at least the artist, has to break with ancestral tradition. And here, the prototype probably for almost everyone in this room, in this metaphorical room, is Stephen Dedalus in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. So in other words, the classic intellectually correct progression is, yes, it's okay to start out being religious. It's okay to grapple with it and so on. But if you're going to be a real thinker, then of course you have to break with it at some point, like Stephen Dedalus saying, I must forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race, and so on. So all of this, but at the same time, the problem for people who do grow up in a religious tradition, the problem there is that things can be so obvious that they don't need to be spelled out. And in fact, things are so obvious that one oneself does not even see them. They're part of the mental woodwork. They're part of the wallpaper. So it's not actually always clear what it is that one should stress and that one needs to stress for the various different audiences that you describe. And I'm still not sure if to what extent that worked, to what extent it didn't. We can talk about that. My initial goal in writing this book was to push back against the more negative assessments of confession in Russia. So one of the things that I first tried to do was to take the tack that yes, there was compulsion, but it was a kind of democratizing compulsion, that the requirement for annual confession and communion for Orthodox Christians in the Russian Empire applied to everyone. So it was one of the few rights that everyone had in common. And so that it's worth looking at for this reason. The other pushback was that why assume that compulsion is always bad? And you mentioned War and Peace, and I'm assuming you mean Natasha Rostova and her Govenia, but to my mind, the classic example is Konstantin Levin, who has to go to confession before he can marry Kitty. So those were the background assumptions. So imagine my dismay when I started to read more, and I realized that first, although it was supposed to be democratizing, at least in the 18th century, really it was only the nobility and the officers who could be tracked with any kind of who could be tracked really in any kind of way, because they were the only ones who were on exhibit, and they were the only ones also who really mattered to the crown in the 18th century, frankly, because this is the great century of palace coups and everything else. And palace coups do not come from the peasantry, they come from the military and they come from the elites. It's only in the 19th century that it actually becomes democratizing. And so the other problem that I faced as I started doing this is that I realized that although everyone likes to focus on Peter, and although everyone blames Peter, that when one looks at confession in the Russian Empire, the turning point is not Peter. The turning point is Alexei Mikhailovich. The turning point is around the time of Patriarch Nikan. The turning point is the point when the Ruthenians, which is to say Ukrainians, Belarusians, the Orthodox Christians who are living in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when they introduce the Trebnik of Petro Могила in 1646, which does change the words of absolution in a way that gives more power to the priest relative to what the situation had been in Russian Orthodoxy earlier. So what we attribute to Peter from a religious point of view, actually in almost all cases has its roots in Alexei Mikhailovich. The problem there is that my graduate training included almost nothing about the 17th century. So I had to learn the literature. And that actually ended up taking quite a long time, because you can't just read one or two books and say, okay, I'm now competent to talk about the problems of the 17th century. It's actually a lot. And that's why the footnotes in chapter 1 are so long, because I wanted to show that I actually really did know the material and understand the material with which I was engaging. The 18th century, like I'm actually, for people who have read the book, I'm very curious to get feedback on that section, because the entire 19th century and the early 20th century was paradoxically the easiest to write, in the sense that I already knew most of the historical and cultural context to begin with, so it wasn't a massive amount of filling in gaps. I only had to read the stuff related to confession and not everything else. But in the 18th century, I'm realizing now that although I focused on the legal context, on the context of the Duchovny Reglament of Peter the First, that there was actually more about the cultural context that other people can and should fill in. And I wish that I had done a little bit more of it. I mean, I tried to do what I could, but we can talk more about that later. What I want to stress also is that there really are two distinct strands which sometimes come together in the book in terms of the aspect of church and state, and also the aspect of so in other words, the purely civic aspect, the legal aspect. So that's on the one hand. The other side is the church requirement aspect of confession before communion. So the state authorities in Russia were interested in having people go to confession and communion for their own purposes, loyalty, education, etc. But the church requirement of confession before communion is something that Russian Orthodox Christianity shared with other contemporary versions of Christianity. That requirement was there in Roman Catholicism. Some branches of the Reformed churches were also very concerned to protect the altar table from unworthy communicants, to ensure that people prepared properly. And so these two things often came together, but they are not the same thing. And the interesting thing that happens by the end of the 19th century, and especially we see this in the beginning of the 20th century, we start to see signs of frustration with both aspects. Right? That on the political and civic side, you have the paintings by Repin of political prisoners refusing the last confession offered to them before they were executed. So there is a side on the part of people who are politically left that yes, confession, communion, the clergy are politically tainted, and therefore we're going to distance ourselves from this. But almost more interesting, I think, is that there is already some frustration with the religious, the purely religious, leaving aside everything civic about it, the purely religious aspect of the whole Gavenia routine of having to attend church morning and evening for 3 days before you could go to confession, the waiting in long lines. And the interesting thing is that this frustration, this purely religious frustration with Gavenia as practiced in the Russian Empire was reflected both in literature and in theology. To quote our beloved favorite Leskov in one of his short stories, Lisa teases the family nanny, saying that she, Lisa, wants to change her faith and join the Germans so as never have to do Gavenia again. I quote in Russian, «Я вот хочу Жене веру переменить, чтобы не говеть никогда». Right? I want to change my faith so I never have to go through Gavenia again. And bishops also acknowledged that it was that Protestants in Russia used the lure of escaping Gavenia as a successful way of tempting people away from Orthodoxy. The Russian quote, I want to read this actually, is «Оно», referring to Protestantism, «лукаво обещает им свободу от влияния духовенства, от строгих правил и уставов нашей церкви и от тягостного для нерадивых людей говения и приготовления к приобщению святых тайн». So in English, it maliciously promises them freedom from the influence of the clergy, from the strict rules and regulations of our church, and from Gavenia and preparation for communion of the holy mysteries, which is onerous for shirking people. Now, of course, you can say that these fissures, these acts of rebellion, show how securely Gavenia had entrenched itself in Russian practice. And so, of course, one of the things that one might ask is, okay, if Gavenia, if the whole complex of beliefs and practices is so much a part of the Russian church, state, cultural machine, what then happens when the machine falls apart? What happens when that smychka stops being smychka? To a certain extent, I guess, you will just have to wait because the book stops in 1917. But it is an interesting question to ask, and I hope that it's something that we will get to. So why don't I stop there, perhaps, because if you leave me to my own devices, I can speak indefinitely, and I would rather hear your questions, Anne.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I have a few questions for you, some of which we've discussed beforehand, but I won't take too much time before opening it up to the floor. I was hoping just to hear a little bit more about how you conceived of your audience, particularly as you were doing the research for this group, for the book, and as you were writing. How did you deal with these code switching requirements as you were thinking about how to write the book?
Well, I think that one of the most potentially one of the most disillusioning aspects for people who come from the Russian Orthodox context, who read this book, is realizing that I'm not writing this book for them, that I'm writing this book for Europeanist historians. And so the audience that I had in mind first and foremost were not people raised in the Russian Orthodox tradition who had questions about their faith or who wondered more about it. That my primary audience, I'm sorry, all of you people out there, my primary audience was in fact people who wrote books about European history, people who wrote books about Europe and did not include Russia in the conversation. That just killed me. So they were my primary audience, I admit. But that said, I found in book number 1 about Jan Kronstadtski that the reading audience in Russia was actually much larger than the reading audience in any other languages. And that, of course, makes sense. And that makes me very happy. So there were people who thought of themselves as Russian Orthodox insiders as well. And so the challenge there was, how do you, precisely as you say, what do you give one group? What do you give the other group? And I wonder whether there is enough stuff that's not about the law. And I wonder if there's enough stuff about how religion was practiced, because it seemed to me in almost everything that I had read, there were loads of people who had read texts coming out of the Russian Orthodox Church. At least there were people who had read sermons. There were people who had read the questions that priests were in theory supposed to ask at confession. So there were enough people, there were enough Russian Orthodox clerics who knew that material, but there weren't so many people who sat in the consistories of Kazan, of Kiev, of St. Petersburg, of Moscow. And because frankly, going to those consistories and digging through those files is mechanically the hardest to do, because you can't just like Google Govenia and have the stuff come up. You have to actually physically go to Kazan and sit there and look through little sheet of paper after little sheet of paper. So I decided to put the most emphasis on that. I did want to, modeling myself on Cecilia Gaposchkin's work on the Crusaders and on the liturgy of the Crusaders, I thought that I should explain the Lenten context of confession, because even though Lent exists over most Christian traditions, the timing of the Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox approach to Lent, so the different Sundays of Lent, the points at which during Lent most people would have been likely to go to confession. And so you ask yourself, what did they hear when they went to church on those days, right? So in other words, it's not enough to think in the abstract. You have to actually try to recreate the liturgical experience of people going to confession and communion in the Russian Empire at this specific time. That also, by the way, makes it easier to cheat a little bit, and you don't have to read theological journals for the whole year. If you're interested in confession and communion, it's enough to read theological journals from the end of January to the beginning of April, because that's really the only time when they wrote about confession and communion. I mean, I actually checked it and did like a sample year. I thought, well, just for sport, let's read June, July, August, September, October, November. It's like, nope. It really is. The references to confession and communion really are concentrated in those months. So that was, and also the anonymous reviewers who reviewed the book also had things to say about that. So I followed their guides.
Thank you. Well, I'm certainly very glad that you went to Kazan and Kiev and looked through all of those little pieces of paper, because the book is incredibly rich in it gives such a sense, a sort of a thick description of how people lived these religious practices and how they thought about them. And I was very grateful for that. I have a question about gender. This is something that you talk about quite a lot in the book, and you note that across various Christian traditions, Roman Catholic, Anglican, Lutheran, and now you're showing Russian Orthodox, it's been observed that women seek out confession more often than men do. First of all, I'm wondering why you think this is. Does anyone have theories about that? You also talk about how women seek out, in the Russian Orthodox context, I think, relations of what could be called dependency on their father confessors, both in the 19th century and then again in the 1990s. But at the same time, you talk about how women put their confessions into writing. They became these sort of important ego documents, how they used confession as an opportunity to tell their life stories. So how do you put these phenomena together, the sort of dependency versus agency, when you're thinking about women and confession?
Okay. I think that all of these things are connected and connected in ways that are not immediately obvious. Probably the central point is access to the priest. I think that people who don't come from the Russian Orthodox context don't realize how easy it is for the average guy to just like come up to the ikonostas, open the door of the altar and go in. Like all you have to do is make the sign of the cross. That's it. You're in. Like basically you just have to be a guy. That's all it takes. So it's much easier. I mean, that when one reads about the memoirs of people who lived at the time of Jan Kronstadt, like you read about all these guys who say, and to get better access to him, I went next to the altar. I went behind the door of the ikonostas. This access is objectively impossible for women. Like they literally can't go there. And so therefore, I'm actually wondering if in religious traditions where female clerics have been introduced and where they've been allowed, will having access make it like demystify it somehow, and will having access make confession less special for women, and will make it more like the way that it is for men? Because if you don't feel that other opportunities for voice are closed to you, then you might not care so much. Whereas confession for women in all of these traditions was one of the only opportunities where they could be guaranteed that they could actually have an extended conversation with a priest who had to listen to them, right? And at the same time, though, like the dependency thing is interesting, because the thing that's striking about the early and mid 19th century, especially on the part of elite women, is the extent to which they insist, as one would say in French, that they insist upon having a priest who is their intellectual and spiritual equal. Like I have never found a woman in the 19th century writing with slight condescension the way that Levin does after his confession, or the way that Freemasons who went in the late 18th, early 19th century did. That you have men talking about how like, oh, I went to confession to this good, simple priest, and I saw that he knew something that I, in my wisdom, did not. That's not good enough for women, right? Like at least educated women want a priest who is going to be at least their peer. I mean, but because they don't have as much physical access to clerics, that a lot of this relationship happens in writing, right? So for elite women in particular, that the idea of putting confessions in writing comes almost organically out of the genre of the religious correspondence, or perhaps even out of the genre of the epistolary novel. But the big surprise there is that for bishops and for the monastic elders that these educated women write, that the bishops also, and you can tell in reading their responses, that they've been waiting for an opportunity where they can like take off the klovuk, like let down their guard, and actually have a relationship of like back and forth of normal intellectual discourse. What do you think of Capodistrias and the Greek Revolution? Like that kind of thing. So that's why the dependency thing is interesting, because it's not, it doesn't necessarily have to follow. And the dependency makes sense in a monastic context, because there, of course, that's connected to not the relatively standard annual confession and communion that people did to their parish priest. There, the idea was that it really was about examination of conscience, disclosure of thoughts, like a regular intimate relationship with a father confessor predicated on obedience, right? Unquestioning obedience to your spiritual father. And again, that makes sense in a monastic context where poverty, chastity, and obedience are what you sign on for, right? That's part of the job description. So it's interesting how in the end of the 19th century, in particular, you have priests like Father Valentin Amfiteatrov, incidentally, the father of the satirical writer Alexander Amfiteatrov. So like a lot of like priest-kid tension going on there, I think, that he insists on like really, really strong dependency. One would, I think in the 90s, they would have called it codependency, but the kind of relationship of dependency and unquestioning obedience for his spiritual daughters that one would regard as unhealthy by any measure. And this is something that Maya Kucherskaya, who I gather will be coming to New York, which is great, I envy all of you, writes so brilliantly about in her book Современный пацерик, about religious life in the 1990s, how after communism, when Soviet era practices like general confession were put into question, that not only was were some pre-revolutionary practices brought back, but somehow people got the idea that monastic practices like disclosure of thoughts, like complete submission to a spiritual father, something that would not have occurred to anyone living in the Russian or in the Russian Empire in the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century. Some people started to think that this was normal, right? And like I don't talk about this in the book because I stopped in 1917, but it's an interesting moment because on the one hand, they're in relationships for the women for whom this applies. On the one hand, they're in relationships of dependency. On the other hand, when they put themselves in a position of dependency to a really famous spiritual father, then they can write his life story and write their story into his story. And so it's an interesting dynamic that I haven't thought enough about, but that I'm starting to think about more closely and want to think more about in the future. And then, of course, there's the issue of autobiographical narrative and how much it matters to be able to tell your story. I mean, I find, in fact, very interesting that in theological manuals, they instruct father confessors, to keep bringing people back to the subject and not go off on tangents, sort of, and another thing, and just one more thing. It's like, no, can you please just talk about your sins and not where, why, who, when, etc. So does that kind of address what you meant?
Yes, thank you very much. I think there's so much to be explored there. And that's a really great beginning. Maybe I'll just ask a couple of more questions or combine them, two questions into one, and then we'll open it. Because the book is, although the book's a history of confession, it's also a lot about literary representations of confession, which now I've become alerted to. And I'm interested in how you chose which representations to include in the book. Lots of Tolstoy, Tsarskaya, some Liskov, not much Dostoevsky at all, which is striking. So that's one question, how you chose which literary representations to include. And the other is kind of a larger question that you've started to address, which is, if we were to write a history of reading in Russia, and there's recent 3 or 4 volumes that have come out of University of Milan on the history of reading in Russia, what would it do to that history of reading, do you think, if we would include more about confession and written confession? So I'll let you address that, and then soon we'll open it up to the audience.
Okay. The answer for which writers went in and which didn't was, I'm afraid, something that Nabokov would, cover his face with horror at if he heard this. I based it on to what extent the writers described confession as practiced by most of the people most of the time. So Dostoevsky, the reason that there's not that much about Dostoevsky is that even though you have wonderful people like Zosima and Brothers Karamazov, and even though Dostoevsky talks a great deal about starchestvo in Brothers Karamazov, even though you have that wonderful confession of Stavrogin in Biesy to Tikhon, and that chapter that was deemed so scandalous that it wasn't published in the first version because it described someone repenting of child rape. So I wanted writers who captured confession as it did happen for most people most of the time, which is to say the annual confession and communion that they were all obliged to do. And from this point of view, children's literature in general is great, and accounts of children's confessions are great, especially children's first confessions, because that is the rite of passage moment where you become, as a child, where you become like a thinking person and they take you seriously. And I mean, yes, you can say, well, this is the age of responsibility, but the point is that you now are held accountable for your actions. You have to tell a story, etc. So Charskaya talks a great deal about confession as practiced in girls' schools, in elite girls' institutes. Chekhov talks about confession for village boys and so on. And it's and I think the reason that children's literature, or young adult literature, if you want to call it that, is such a good source is because that's when kids are reading, and that's also when they experience confession with all its intensity. And Tolstoy, even in Voskresenia, even in Resurrection, when he gets in a little more like negative social context, still it's quite accurate based on memoirs, literature, court cases, and everything else. The people who I would have liked to do more with were Amfiteatrov's son, Alexander, because he actually, in like works of 19th century literature that most people don't read, thank you, the other 19V, is, books like Dочь Victoria Pavlovna, where he sees the women who've become the groupies of his father. He thinks this is deeply sick. And so he describes this in works of literature that are actually fascinating, because you hear people opining that there are some things that are so confidential that a woman should only tell them to another woman, and she should never tell them to any man, even to a priest, which is actually in a work of 19th century Russian literature. This is actually reasonably surprising and interesting. And of course, more Saltykov's Shchedrin and everything else. But you asked about reading. I actually, since you plugged those books in the other 9TV section, I actually went and took a look at the table of contents to see what they write. And the only chapters that seem as if they might be related to an adequate discussion of reading practices of religion is for the 18th century, what, how, and why the Orthodox clergy read in 18th century Russia. Okay, that's interesting, but that's the Russian Orthodox clergy. What are Russian Orthodox people reading in the 18th century? What about laity? What about women? In the 19th century book, there are two things that are quite general, like the book and the peasant in the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, from illiteracy to the religious book to the secular book. And that's actually very tantalizing, because from illiteracy to the religious book to the secular book, meaning that implying in the title that the religious book is a stage that you go through before you like grow up to the real stuff, the secular book. And at this, I just want to say that, come on, that's like dismissing, given how much religious literature women wrote, not only read, but also wrote in the 19th, early 20th, and in the centuries, and again after the 1990s, that is it really enough to dismiss religious literature as middlebrow or feminine, and that's it? And that therefore it's like it's somehow sub, and that therefore one moves on to it. I did want to say also, it occurred to me just like one small tantalizing thing about the Soviet period, because I kind of left that dangling, which is to say, so if you have this smychka through 1917, really, then what happens afterwards? And there are some great Zoshchenka stories about people going to confession. And there's one in particular about a peasant woman at confession, and the priest is like asking her, so what about this and what about this? And he says, okay, like your son is an atheist. Does he say this and does he say this? So you can tell that the priest is like really worked up about secular propaganda or anti-religious propaganda, and the peasant woman is going, oh, I don't know, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. And then the priest finally says, is he saying, does he say that it's all physics and it's all chemistry and none of it is true? And then there's a pause, and the priest says, maybe none of it is true. and the peasant woman goes like, what? That's like, come on, man, that's not why I'm here. And then there are other Zoshchenka stories where and this is like somehow reflected in what Johann Helbeck and Igal Halfin write about in their works, that how confession is repurposed, appropriated in uniquely Bolshevik era rituals of recanting and basically in confessing publicly for class crimes or anything else. But I actually like an example of the kind of thing that's really fun is a Shukshin story that became the basis of a film called Biletik na Vторой Seans, a movie made in 1978 where a collective farm guy gets drunk and he thinks that he sees the image of Saint Nicholas appear, and so he confesses to him, but it turns out to be his father-in-law. So on the one hand, haha, but on the other hand, this shows that it's still there. And so that it was painful for me to stop in 1917, because I had actually, at one point, I thought I would be really ambitious and have the break come with Nicholas I for volume 1, have it be a 2-volume thing, like Richard Wortman and ceremonial and all of that. So the break comes with Nicholas I. So on the one hand, you have the building and the high point of the church-state relationship, and then from Alexander II onwards, what happens when the state stops caring, right? So what happens, and so basically to go through the late imperial period, the Soviet period, and the post-Soviet period. Sadly, it took me so long to do, even through 1917, that I thought if I do the 2-volume plan, the late imperial part might never see the light of day, and it's too important to keep sitting on it for another 15 years. So that's.
Well, I commend you for having the discipline to stop, and we're all very grateful because it's an extremely valuable book. So I certainly could ask more questions, but instead of doing that, I'm going to ask Sasha to open up, to unmute everyone, and also open up the chat. I am moderating this myself, and we'll see how good or bad I am at that. So I will keep my eye on the chat for your questions. I'll also, which is probably the best way to ask them, and I will also try to see if you're waving your little yellow hand or something like that. So please, questions.
Thank you, Nadia, for the book and for your presentation. I did actually have one comment about what you said about how you chose your literary selections. And it occurred to me that in children's literature, what they're doing is they're describing the very thing that you're trying to describe. They're trying to describe what confession is and how you should feel about it and what you should do and all of that sort of thing. So that may be another reason why it's perfect for your purposes, because there you get the things that other Orthodox already know, so they don't need to write about it, but children aren't in that category. But I guess I'm curious, and I don't know whether you actually discussed this in your book or not, but how did ordinary Orthodox people feel after confession? Did it serve the purpose of improving their relationship to God, their relationship to their families, all those things that at least Catholic priests promise people, that if they confess their sins, they'll feel better afterwards. But because there is this kind of state role in it, I wondered if that changed that part of it. And then the other basic question that I have is I know that there's the annual requirement to go to confession, but could the Orthodox also go to confession at other times of the year to make it a more private kind of conversation with their priest? So that's it.
Thank you. The answer to both of those very perceptive questions is, oddly enough, liturgy. Because I think the thing that attenuated the state aspect of it, and this, by the way, is why another reason why confession might have been more authentic for women than for educated men, is that most women didn't have to go to confession as part of their jobs or for their jobs, which is to say that if you were in the military, you went with your regiment. If you worked in an office, like the office all went in at the same time and so on. So you're less likely to feel the hand of the state as a woman than as you are than as a man. But liturgy, because like in the Roman Catholic Church, like, also bear in mind, it took a long time for the practice of confession more often than once a year to take in the Catholic Church also. And in the Catholic Church for centuries, even after the Council of Trent, it was actually the practice that, similar to what happened in Russian Orthodoxy as well, which is to say, pious people went 4 times a year, which is to say, in the Orthodox case, during each of the 4 fasts, during each of the 4 fasting periods. So before Easter, before Christmas, before Dormition, and before the Apostles, before St. Peter's and Paul's Day on June 29th. Yeah, June 29th. So in both cases, confession is tied to liturgy, and it is liturgy. It is because the emphasis in the texts is on repentance as a process, and because the texts are so gorgeous. When one hears those texts, when one is in that vibe, it becomes whether it improves one is an interesting question, but certainly one gets the feeling of doing, to put it very, very crudely, one's spring cleaning, right? So in that sense, it's also like that 2-week period in Judaism between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where like this is like the annual checkup. And in that sense, the Russian Orthodox thing is not surprising. It's not unique. But I think also the thing that's specific about the Russian case, and something that frustrated clerics a great deal, was that because Gavenia was so connected to restraint, because it was so connected to not being like ordinary time, because you're taken out of ordinary time and ordinary practice, and you're in church morning at night, and you're thinking about your sins, and you're doing examinations of conscience. And we know that people actually did this, that you're fasting, you're doing this. And so it's literally unsustainable in regular life, in real life. And once people go to communion, the point is, for most people, okay, that means that now, once again, all bets are off. And like, once again, I can eat meat and drink milk and have sex and get loaded and all of that. And so, and so for priests, it was actually very frustrating that on the one hand, people did have a sense that at least for the day that they had communion in nice, clean clothes and they were reborn, there was a sense that you should try to preserve this, to try to maintain this sense of purity and all's right with the world, which is actually also why some people thought it was bad for kids to go to confession, because they said, because it's in the nature of kids to laugh and run around and romp and frolic, and they can't sustain this intensity after they have communion. They're like, I can take off my church clothes and go running around and, all that. So does that?
Yes, thank you.
Nadia, we have a line of questions. First from Sergei Olhovsky, who says, did you come across any texts of clergy also complaining about or questioning the benefit of this lengthy process of gonienia, that is the clergy themselves?
Yes. And in fact, the interesting thing is World War I and what happens during World War I. If one reads church periodicals like Церковные ведомости, Церковный вестник, and so on, one does detect frustration. And the problem is that priests now themselves feel their own sense of worthiness, and that they want to be in a position to impose things on their flocks. Their flocks are becoming more assertive. Their bishops are tending to take the side of lay people over priests in any confession-related complaints, especially after 1905. So priests are starting to feel like, what am I, chopped liver? I mean, that in other words, that the balance of power after the revolution of 1905 seems to be shifting to lay people. And in fact, it's already during World War I, when there's more experimenting with Общая исповедь, with the general confession at the front, that they actually start doing it in some parishes as well, and people like it. So that one of the things that the revolution of 1917 does is to make things like the Great Church Council of 1917, 1918 possible. Like, it wasn't possible really for priests to talk about this in a meaningful way until the most pious emperor and then martyr Nicholas II abdicated, and so that they could finally have this church council and discuss some of these issues. And so, yes, there was some frustration with this on the part of priests, and many priests, when faced with the possibility of getting rid of the whole Gavenia thing, they jumped at it. That's true. That is true.
Thank you, Nadia. We have a question from Luca Nahutrashvili, who says, thanks for the very enlightened presentation. I'd like to know how confession worked for Orthodox subjects who were not Russian, like Georgian. Were there any substantial differences in the politics of confession between the ethnically Russian poor and an Orthodox colony?
I have been waiting all these years for someone to write about this. I mean, my problem and curse is that I don't know any of the other Orthodox languages. I don't know Georgian, I don't know Greek, I don't know Romanian, I don't know Arabic. And so I would love to know the answer to this question. I mean, I address this to the best that I can, which is to say that, I mean, the point is, in the book, I understand that it's different. I mean, that in other words, if I can say with confidence that practice in Ukraine was different, because it was, if I can say with confidence that practice in Kazan was different, because it was, then surely all the more it would be different in Georgia. But because I didn't know Georgian, didn't and don't know Georgian, and because one has only so much time and everything else, I can only put out a plea to everyone saying that, yes, I know that the Georgian church was heavily Russified in the 19th century. I do understand this. So I do not know the answer to this question, but I wish that I did, and I wish that someone would do this. I hope maybe you should do it, please.
Unmuted, sorry. I missed a question earlier. This is from Andrew Fidosov, who asks, could you please clarify the role of policing and punishing in Paschaltide confession? Did clergy report misdeeds?
Clergy did not report misdeeds. I mean, and in fact, that wasn't the point of what clergy was supposed to do. Clergy were supposed to keep records. Clergy were supposed to keep records and send them in, because really what clergy was concerned about was whether people came to confession or communion, period. All right. That said, the middle of the 19th century, the reign of Nicholas I and the first years of the reign of Alexander II, because it's not like, okay, we change emperors and this changes overnight. That is the period of the most intense police enforcement of confession in the Russian Empire. And so I think it's actually interesting that when you have, for example, that you do, like there is some pressure on priests by the law to say, okay, at his deathbed, did someone say something about this? And the priest, say, no, I can't say anything about that because it was at confession and so on. And so they understand that they're not supposed to say anything. But on the other hand, there are also cases, again, from this middle of the 19th century, it's the only time when I found them, when a priest writes that a priest hears the confession of someone who doesn't seem to have confessed anything really bad, and yet the guy is arrested, and the priest wants to know if he can give him communion without checking with the police first. So, in other words, priests in the middle of the 19th century, are definitely cowed by the presence of the police, but really. In most of the time, though, the police basically serve like the purpose of Federal Express or DHL, which is to say that if someone has to be brought to confession or communion or something, not to communion, but that the priest basically like deliver a note. It's kind of like being served. It's where. Okay, so I noticed you haven't been in 5 years. I noticed you haven't been in 10 years. You'd better show up, or it's time to do penance in a monastery. But that is not universal over the entire span. It's like this perfect storm in the middle of the 19th century, which then disperses almost instantly by the end of the 1860s. Does that? Okay, I'll assume that's enough of an answer.
Thank you. We have a question from Emily Wang, who says, thank you for this wonderful event. I look forward to the book. You spoke a bit about the relationship between political and religious confession in the Soviet period. Could you elaborate a little bit more about the relationship between political and religious confession in the 19th century? For example, the Decembrists and other political prisoners. Emily, I have to say the part on the Decembrists in the book is really fascinating. So
yeah. Thank you, Anne. In fact, I was about to say, in fact, I can say very little about the Soviet period, but I can say much more about the 19th century. The Decembrists are a really interesting case for me, because that is the last moment where you have elite male political prisoners for whom confession can still be real. Like there are 5 of them. I mean, I can flip through the book and try to remember their names, who actually, they ask to be allowed to do Gavenia during Lent, right? So that, in other words, they're not being made to do it, they're being asked to do it, which shows that even though like they understand that it's Nicholas I, who is to a certain extent not the Nicholas I that he turns into in the 1830s and the 1840s, but still, they understand that there might be consequences, and yet at the same time, they want to go to confession and communion anyway. And it is interesting that some of the Decembrists report that the that the priest hearing their confessions like seems to be taking out, you know, a piece of paper and basically seems to be like ready to jot down notes about what they're going to say. And so for them, this means the end, but it doesn't for all of the Decembrists. What is true, and that I think that Nicholas I, with the Decembrists, but especially with people like Bakunin, and especially with people like Mayor Martynov, who kills Lermontov in the duel, that he wants to make a point of their going to confession and communion and doing public penance, because he wants to make an example of them, and he wants to make sure that they don't think that they should be able to get away with dueling in the case of Martynov. And in the case of Bakunin, he actually, like, he tries to get into his head the way that Catherine II did with Radishchev a little bit, and to say, think of me as your father confessor, write me your ispoveds. And I only learned of this after the book went to press, unfortunately, but there's a very good article about this by Nicholas Bujalski that I can send to you if you're interested, about Bakunin specifically. So I think that it's the end of the reign of Nicholas I where it starts being problematic for elite men in particular.
Thank you. We have a question from Joseph Bradley, who writes, at the opening, you disagree with Pipes's negative interpretation of Russian Orthodoxy. This is part of Pipes's broader view of Russian exceptionalism, also negative, of course, but the direction of the historical profession in the last couple of decades has been transnational, to reject exceptionalism. This is certainly pronounced in American history. Do you see yourself as a historian who, in general, sees Russia in transnational rather than in exceptional terms?
Yes. Yes, and I'm, and if it weren't inappropriate to say, I would say yes, and I'm proud of it. That I think one can make a case for exceptionalism, but that, here I feel kind of like Belinsky writing his letter to Gogol, but that case, what we've mumbled that case long enough. I mean, I think that we actually need, at the very least, as a corrective, to make the case for transnationalism. And yes, that is absolutely part of the historiographical tendency, and it's a part it's a part of absolutely what I'm trying to do. I think it will be healthier for people who are working with Russian Orthodoxy, and I think it will be healthier for people who aren't working on Russian Orthodoxy, to see where Russian Orthodoxy fits on the continuum, and to look at it from the perspective, not perhaps of Constantinople or of Athens or of Belgrade, or of Tbilisi, not that those aren't good and important perspectives, they are, but to look at it from the perspective of Paris, London, Dusseldorf, like Wiesbaden, I don't know. So that was an easy question, because the answer is yes.
I actually have a kind of follow-on comment, more or less, about exceptionalism. It's just that comes out of the fact that I was trained also as an Americanist. So I studied 19th century American literature mostly. And my dissertation advisor was Soklan Berkovich, who was one of the preeminent Americanists of the 20th century, 21st century. And he was a scholar of Puritanism. So even though he wrote mostly on the 19th century and on sort of the, American Renaissance texts, it was absolutely saturated in his knowledge of a particular religious text and religious tradition that were seen to be inseparable. So in that way, it's always been surprising to me and a little bit worrisome that I was not trained in that way on the Russian side. Right. I mean, the way that I learned American literature was sort of assuming that people who produced and consumed these 19th century texts were steeped in a certain Protestant tradition. And it was necessary to know it.
Yes. I mean, and you're right. I mean, in the sense that when I studied literature at Harvard, Yuri Streeter, Vsevolod Sichkaryov, Kirill Taranovsky, I don't know, just, pick almost any name out of a hat. It just was not on the agenda. Like, it might as well not have existed. Streeter came closest when he talked about the origins of the Russian theater and brought in liturgy there and things like the washing of the feet ritual. But it is slightly astonishing to me, to the degree to which the divide between secular and religious, between clergy and nobility, that Laurie Manchester talks about in her book about priests' children who then didn't go into the clergy. It's interesting to me that this is reproduced in the scholarship on literature, and I wish that were not the case. Now, to be fair to Richard Pipes, he did teach a class at Columbia on Russian conservative thought. So it was possible to read Berdyaev, for example, and it was possible to read Leontiev. So, but nevertheless, those are Russian thinkers, and that's Russian religious thought. It's not the same as reading like hardcore Russian Orthodox texts. So it's, that it's time, without over exaggerating the influence and impact of Orthodox Christianity. We do need to realize that we do need to write it back into the picture and have it be at least part of the, basso continuo or the ostinato, da-da-dum, da-da-dum, da-da, like it's there, and we forget it at our peril.
Thank you. Yes, I definitely, that's what I've been coming to understand just over the last couple of years. Another thing that I came to understand partly through your work is how deeply even 19th century elites knew kind of Orthodox practice, like they couldn't help it. Whether they believed it, whether they were sort of offhand about it, whether they centered it in their lives or not, they knew it. And that has also been very useful to me. And we kind of know that about Chekhov, Yeskov, obviously. But it's just become more visible to me in my reading because of your work.
Someone in one of the sessions of the other 19V said something very funny about how when I come across references to religion, I treat them, like in Russian literature, I treat them the same way that I treat stuff about the military and details on military uniforms, like, yeah, and turn the page. In other words, it's there, but I don't really have to deal with it. But I would actually submit, I'm not sure about military uniforms, but I think we do have to deal with Russian Orthodox details.
Yeah, and I've actually found that when I slow down with the students, including with the undergraduates, they're interested. They do take it in, and they do better than they do with like Turgenev's description of grass. That you can bring them into to discussions of, say, liturgy, and that's been helpful.
Well, this is to follow up on the last point, because Nadia and I are on a panel in New Orleans on orthodoxy and nature. And I was the instigator of this panel, in part because when I started working on my gardening project and came across, of course, immediately commentary on the part of elite men who were involved in all these gardening societies. And when they wrote about gardening in their lives, it was always about God. And God was just absolutely fundamental. And we're talking about, princes, but also we're talking about military officers, bureaucrats, who I think of as completely soulless in any sense of the word. And so I really wanted to know more about this, because I think I realized myself that I didn't understand. On some level, I understand orthodoxy and what it is because of having been raised Catholic. I get that part of it, but I wanted to know more specifically about the Orthodox what makes Orthodoxy special. And I realize this contradicts what you were just saying, but the ways in which it presents itself and its views of nature in a different way, perhaps, than the way Catholics would, or Protestants for that matter. So I do think it is really important, and it's really hard to get at because it's not something that people talk about because it's their religious upbringing, and it's just there, right? And you know the practices, you know the rituals because you've been to church. And then I think it makes it a little bit harder for us as scholars to kind of tease that out of these descriptions and to understand the sort of the underlying context of what is really being said here. What is the religious faith that's being expressed? Is it something that is their own, or is it traditionally Orthodox? Anyway, that's.
Well, I mean, I think the other or an other layer of complication is that most of us are urban people, and we spend most of our time in cities. And I mean, you're doing the gardening project, so I assume you have at least an amateur interest in gardening.
Oh yes.
Okay, all right, good for you. I don't, but the. I think that in reading written confessions in particular, and especially the written confessions written by rural people, you understand the extent to which details of rural life are part of how they think and what they react to. I mean, that what I found interesting actually about reading 19th century priests' manuals about what to ask people at confession and what to ask peasants at confession. One of the questions was, did you hurt animals? And what's interesting about that to me is that, of course, we all know the description of Dostoevsky and that poor horse being beaten, and whatever else. And we know that the late 19th century is when the ASPCA, or the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, like this is taking off everywhere, mostly in the context of feathers on women's hats, and the extent to which, the natural world is being exploited by fashion, by capitalism, by all of this. But the Patriarch of Constantinople now, the ecumenical patriarchate, the ecumenical patriarch has made the protection of nature a central concern, and of course climate change and all of that. And there's actually a fascinating moleben, Te Deum, it would be called, in your neck of the woods, Christine, that is about for the environment, which is meant to be served on, get this, September 1st, the day of the Church New Year. So like the renewal of nature, the protection of nature. And this was originally written in Greek. It's been translated into English, and and everything else. But I actually think I don't know if there are systematic studies. I mean, I would guess that because of the ecumenical patriarch, I would guess that most of it is being done by Greeks now. Studies of the Orthodox tradition of how to deal with nature and everything else. The transfiguration of nature, the descriptions of nature. In fact, now that I start thinking about it, I realize that it's there in liturgy. So that may be where that's coming from.
What's interesting to me is that, yes, you're right that there are Greek scholars who are writing about this, but it has had a profound influence on American, in particular, environmentalists who want to put the sacred back into environmentalism. And they have been reading all of the sort of Russian Orthodox literature that they can get their hands on in translation and find it very compelling.
Okay, now that I think of it, probably the most gorgeous account of the transfiguration, all of that of nature is what happens on January 6th, old calendar, for the Feast of the Epiphany, when the waters are blessed, but then also it's this like gorgeous pan to the transfiguration and the sanctification of all creation. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, so yeah, that's really interesting, actually.
Okay, so you just had a preview of our panel. Everybody come. Thank you, Nadia.
Okay.
We have another question from Joseph Bradley, but first I'll impose just to say something in response to what you were talking about nature and orthodoxy. One of the most memorable and in some ways sad parts of the book is the how quickly, in the face of industrialization and urbanization, it seems that a lot of these structures break down, because Gavrienia in particular depended so much on a community, and on that community being willing to release people from labor for a certain amount of time. And no factory is going to release you from labor so that you can go fulfill your religious obligations. And it was that sort of being taken out of nature, being taken out of the village. It was very clear in the book's narrative that the implications of this were very serious. So anyway, that was just a comment. I'm going to go to Joseph Bradley's question, which is, did baptized Jews go to confession like everybody else? Did the church treat them as full Christians? I ask because Russian right-wing polemicists, presumably informed by Russian Orthodoxy, regarded baptized Jews still as Jews.
For that last part, do you mean in the 19th century or the from the end of the 20th century onwards? Two very different contexts. But leaving that aside, the short answer is yes, and in fact, it was through confession that the church and state figured out if they were like sincere. I mean, there's actually a hilarious case, well, hilarious if you are given to sardonic things. There's a hilarious case in the book about two boys who were prevailed upon to convert to Orthodox Christianity when they when they were drafted into the Russian Imperial Army as cantonists. Again, this is something that happened on the watch of Nicholas I in particular. And then when they became of age, they tried to make the case that they had been converted under duress. But basically they stopped going to confession and communion with their regiments. And then when asked why, they said, well, because this happened under duress and our previous, and then the authorities said, but you went before. And they said, yes, we did go to confession and communion before, but we weren't sincere. And said, but you went, and that's it. Like, that's, once you've gone to confession and communion, that's it. Signed, sealed, and delivered, you do, like, you can't leave, like, I mean, I don't say it's like the Roach Motel, but you can check in, but you can't check out. And so they go back and forth on this. And finally, when the two soldiers are faced with the prospect of being sent to a battalion where they do forced labor, basically, then they say, okay, fine. We'll go to confession and communion, have it your way. And then the response of the authorities was, well, you're not being sincere, or we suspect that you're not being sincere. And so first you have to convince the priest that you're being sincere and you don't just want to avoid forced labor and then do this. But yes, and in fact, this deals with not only Jews, but also, let's say, it happens most often in the military, or in the case of married couples, where, let's say, a Roman Catholic woman converts to Orthodoxy so that she can marry someone and agrees that the children will be brought up Orthodox. But in fact, as soon as her Orthodox husband dies, she starts going to Catholic services once again, and she starts taking her children with her. And there are several cases where, again, because once you accepted conversion, this is before the early 20th century legislation about toleration and let 1,000 flowers bloom and all of that, that because once you did the confession and communion thing once, that's it. You were Orthodox and you had to keep going. It was, it was very difficult to avoid it. But yes, whether you were a convert from Islam, whether you were a convert from Judaism, whether you were a convert from Roman Catholicism, that once you converted for whatever reason, even let's say you were a soldier on your deathbed and you said, just give me a priest, any priest, I want to confess and commune before I die, and then you recover, it's like, you're Orthodox now, too bad. And so, yeah. So that's again, the short answer.
Thank you. I'm looking at the chat to see if we have more questions.
Well, if I may, I would like to tell everyone that a house guest just pulled into the driveway because I told him he could not arrive until 1:30. And it is in fact the stroke of 1:30. So let me simply express my gratitude to everyone for coming. If there's, please feel free to email me individually with any follow-up questions or comments. And if you have a housekeeping to make before I come out and signal to my arriving house guest that it's okay, I can stick around.
Perfect timing. Tell him he nailed it. And thank you all very much. Nadia, congratulations on the wonderful book, and that we will continue the conversation. Bye, everybody. Have a good afternoon.